I want to first, for those of you who read the failing New York Times, there was a fascinating piece by Jeremy Peters this weekend that talked about the president's support among his own party. As much as there has been broad hand-wringing consternation, outrage, frustration, nationally, in the media, certainly in the Democratic Party, the president's approval rating among Republicans is 90%. It is the strongest approval rating among Republicans since any president after George Bush at the height, right after September 11th and the attacks on the World Trade Center. I want to ask all of you, and I'll start with you, Charlie. When you read that, does that tell you that Donald Trump has won the battle for the heart and soul of the grand old party?
Thank you. Well, for the time being, yes, there's no question about it. I mean, we're talking about where do NeverTrumpers go? Well, we're going to go further into the wilderness. We are a very, very small band of brothers. I think I knew we were going to be in the wilderness after the election. I didn't realize it was going to be such a small desert island. But what we've learned a lot about the conservative movement in the Republican Party, that it's tribalist, transactional, and reactionary. And the tribalism, I think, speaks, I think I don't need to define that, the almost cult of personality around Donald Trump, but also the willingness of the party to make this Faustian bargain with him as long as they get certain things that they are willing to tolerate. They are willing to stay silent, but the price tag goes up and up and up. And I think that some of us have been surprised by the degree. And then what I think Jeremy Peters talks about, which is sort of the reactionary nature, the anti-Trumpism, that the more Trump is attacked, the more the tactics against him are escalated, the stronger his supporters dig in. And I think you've seen that over the last 48 hours, and I would expect to see more of that.
Christine, the piece talks about the emotional connection between Trump supporters in the party, which is the vast majority of the party, and the president. It's not one thing that's keeping them there. It's the sense that their guy is under attack. So given the fact that his personality matters so much in that, how broadly should we draw? Is it dangerous to draw too many lessons from the implications of Trumpism if it's really just about Trump himself?
Well, I think, there's a lot of people, and one of the reasons I think this NeverTrump band is so small is that many people thought that, or maybe still continue to think, that once Trump moves from the stage, the Republican Party will revert back to its normal.
Yeah.
Well, there is no normal for the Republican Party anymore. It is the Trump Party. And it's interesting, Pew Research just released some polling data, and you understand in a midterm election that the opposition, the party out of power, is motivated to vote against the party in power. What usually doesn't happen is that the party in power, the Republicans in this case, they don't usually rise to the defense of their president. But historically, what we're seeing is 26% of Republicans are saying that they're making this election about Trump, and it's because they want to defend him, and they think he's under attack. And it doesn't even really matter what he's under attack for. It's just this reflexive, sort of defense of him, because he has defended them and their way of life. And so it's very unusual. And I don't know if it's maybe too early to draw full and complete lessons, but it's more than just Trump.
Mickey, Steve Schmidt, who is a political strategist who was very involved in the McCain campaign, he recently, last week, announced he was leaving the party. As a strategy for moderates, is that a good one, or is it better for moderates to stay in the party and try and help shape the agenda?
That's a very hard call because it gets less hard all the time. I will tell you that at first you say, we fought for who was going to control the Republican Party, who was going to be the voice of the Republican Party, what were going to be the values of the Republican Party, and we had a struggle, and we lost, and maybe we will win next time. But I think that's becoming unsustainable. I think the party has gone so far off the rails, so far off the idea of supporting things that are defensible, that it puts people like me in kind of an awkward position because you want to say, no, it's my party and I'm not going to let these jerks take it over. But on the other hand, You don't want to be in a position where by staying with the party, you're accommodating, you're validating. And so when I got into the Republican Party, which was quite a while ago, I mean, the press called us conservatives because the press likes to come up with titles, but we were really classical liberals. And we were great defenders of the Constitution and of the free press and independent courts and all those things that make a valid democracy. And so it's not just what Trump is saying, that 90% of Republicans today are not bothered by that. That is not sufficient to cause them to walk away. Really makes it harder and harder to say, I want to be wearing that same label that they are wearing.
What did that, I mean, emotionally, how did that make you feel when you heard that 90% of Republicans stand by the president?
It made me sad. It made me shocked. It made me think that all these years, maybe I didn't really know those people as well as I thought I knew them. And let me just add one story that I was telling Charlie this. Some of you know I got a lot of credit for this because during the primary, I was the guy who wrote an article signed by 30 former Republican members of Congress saying that Trump was unfit for office. And so everybody said, oh, great, you got 30 former Republican. They don't know the ones who said no. And that has been disturbing even since to see people like Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and so many others in Congress, that they have not only supported Trump, they have surrendered the constitutional duties of the Congress in order to stand with him. And that's really bothering.
Ramesh, explain to us what you will, if you will. The vodka's already kicking in. Explain to us, if you can, how it feels to be in conservative media, but really sort of established conservative media. Do you feel as if the lane has narrowed in terms of how you can talk about and potentially be critical of this president in an age of such steep partisanship and sort of zero tolerance as far as it concerns criticism within the Republican Party of the Republican president?
It feels great as long as I'm at a bar. That's where I'm going. That's where this NeverTrumper's going, to the bottom of that glass.
That is an old-fashioned for anybody that was wondering.
Yeah, I thought, it's thematically right for a conservative
it's on brand.
As you noted earlier in a very, very nice way, I've been around the block a while in the conservative media world, and I do recall when criticizing George W. Bush on the right as being too much of a big government conservative, for example, was something that got people, a lot of partisan Republicans, pretty upset. So that, in kind, it's not new. In degree, this is much, much more. So much of the criticism and support of Trump is personality-based and character-based, and it's seen as a kind of personal betrayal by some people if you are insufficiently supportive of him. And then on the other side, if you support something that he did, on every sixth day, they'll accuse you of having softened in your opposition, even if, you're not actually changing your mind about anything. It's just he has agreed to something that is a traditional Republican position. I do think that, those of us who are conservatives who couldn't bring ourselves to vote for him, sort of the classic NeverTrump group, we're a small group. Obviously, we weren't electorally decisive in the presidential election, but I think there's a larger group that's contained within the number of Republicans who say they approve of the job he's doing. Those are the conditional supporters, the people who say they're not enthusiastic about everything that he does. There's different ways of breaking it down, but I think something like a fifth of his voters are not necessarily his forever.
Go ahead.
That is absolutely true, but I don't want to undersell how the pressure to conform is intensifying, including in the conservative media. That it's our numbers are shrinking, and your colleague Jonah Goldberg has come up with the analogy of the invasion of the body snatchers, And this has been my experience over the last couple of years is watching Republicans and conservatives, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, as they decide to make their peace with all of this, or they conform. And the pressure to conform is intense. You see that in the electronic media. There's basically right now, at this moment, no business model for conservative media, a successful conservative media, to be consistently Trump skeptical. The number of publications, some of the elements of National Review, some of the elements of the Wall Street Journal editorial board, but it's very, very small. We know everybody. In fact, Mickey and I were at a meeting last week of NeverTrumpers, and we were sitting around a table realizing that if a meteor hit, the entire NeverTrump movement would be destroyed. And the only reason you weren't there, Ramesh, is because you have a designated survivor
I was going to
principle.
say, right.
And you happen to be the one, so that if we all went, there would be one left.
There's one here in Aspen. We're not naming where she is.
Yeah.
So I'm like the Secretary of Transportation.
Yeah, exactly.
But actually, Charlie, when you have conversations with Republicans whose bodies have been snatched, who have gone to the dark side, what is that conversation like? Is there pleading? Is it a visceral conversation, or is it sort of like you've acquiescence?
Okay, well, you have to divide it into different categories. I mean, they're the tribalists, the ones who really, believe that this is the second coming of Ronald Reagan, that he is the man on the white horse. That there's not much of a conversation there.
I guess I'm referring to people who, at one point, sort of there was consternation, but that exists.
Well, that's all the people that I associate with, including people like Paul Ryan, who had no illusions who Donald Trump was, but they made a rational trade-off. In the beginning, it made sense to them. Look, okay, if he is elected, we will get our legislation signed. He will sign our tax cut bill. Hillary Clinton won't. He will appoint conservative judges. Hillary Clinton won't. So if we just go along with this, okay, we get what we want. But that's the thing about the Faustian bargain, is you get things that you want, but then you find out that the price is way higher than you thought. And I think that the thing with people like with my friend Paul Ryan is that I think he gave and sold way more than he was originally intending, because the price with Donald Trump is not just cooperation; it is absolute acquiescence. You must be completely supine, which means you have to be silent about the outrages. You need to enable, the irrational behavior, the racism, the sexism, all of that. And I think that's part of it, is that people try to rationalize, well, look, we are getting these policies, and that justifies the fact that we've caved in.
Let me ask you a follow-up to that, because you know Paul Ryan, you know him in a professional capacity. Paul Ryan is not running for re-election. Paul Ryan is Speaker of the House. This would be a good time for Paul Ryan to say something if he wanted to. So why isn't he?
That's an excellent question. I don't know, except the best explanation I can get is that 80% of his caucus, is 80% of the Republicans represents Trumpian districts, and that if he were to do that, he would probably lose the speakership right now. Now, at a certain point, you go, all right, I'm on the way out the door anyway. But this is part of this dynamic, and Ramesh mentioned it. I mean, you cannot overstate the intensity of the demand for acquiescence to this to this president. It's something, and you mentioned George Bush. I remember when it was completely okay to criticize George Bush, when it was completely okay to criticize Republicans, that it wasn't a sign of that that you were a rhino, or that we allowed that. That is not the case right now. So I mean, Ryan would be excommunicated if he were to do that. But I still think he ought to do it. He's a young man. He's got to look to his legacy. At some point, somebody's got to be able to say, I was not part of that. There is a conservative tradition that is not Trumpism, but that becomes harder to make that case every day.
Christine, we talked about this phenomenon of anti-Trumpism, which seems to be the disease that's felling some of the trees, if you will, right? You don't start out as a pro-Trump person, but you see the swirl of incredibly negative media coverage, the visceral reaction from the left, and you say, you know what, this is a little out of control. I'm an anti-Trump person. And then somehow you've been indoctrinated into pro-Trumpism. Is that, I know I'm getting, it's sort of like being John Malkovich, the layers on layers on layers. But the idea that you can sort of fall into a pro-Trump camp by virtue of taking issue with the the broader treatment of this presidency. Is that something that NeverTrumpers need to be concerned about?
Can I start with something else?
That's a very straightforward way of saying I'm not going to answer your question,
No,
but
no,
sure.
I will. I just wanted to piggyback off Charlie's point, which is I knew and know a lot of Republicans who said, Donald Trump isn't my first choice, or, yeah, he's, not the most perfect person, but Supreme Court justices or tax cut. But here's what it's become. It's become Orrin Hatch, the senior senator from Utah, defending a child molester, Roy Moore, who ran for Senate in Alabama. That's what it's become. And that's why, and the Republican National Committee basically got behind Roy Moore. And it's like at that point, you have to say, is this party worth being a part of? It's gotten so bad that they're defending people like Roy Moore.
Well, okay, then answer that question. What's going through their minds, do you think? If the calculation is no longer a sort of measurable trade-off between tax cuts and morality, then what's the implication?
I don't know. I mean, I can't get in that mindset. I can't believe the level of capitulation that Donald Trump seems to have control over these people. I mean, Orrin Hatch is on his way out. Why did he have to defend Roy Moore? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. So, I don't know.
Mickey, do you want to get in here?
I don't think it's all about Donald Trump. I am more concerned by the 90% who are supporting him than I just about this guy who eventually will leave. I hope. But I've been thinking about what it is that's happening out there in the country that needs to be addressed. And the things, I mean, not to get too carried away with this nutty stuff, but the things that came to my mind were a combination of two things. It was Eric Hoffer's book about the true believer, and that people who are discontented and are looking for something transcendent, something bigger than themselves, a movement to become part of. Mm-hmm. And when they're in that, it's really, really hard to shake their loyalty to that. And then to darken this a little bit more, also Eric Fromm wrote his book, about escape from freedom. And you get these people who are discontented. They think they don't like the outcome. They didn't like the Obama administration. They feel helpless against what's happening, the changes in society. And so they want somebody to fix it. And, right. and that is and that's what they have in Trump. They have abandoned their own agency and said, we need somebody who will fix this for us. And that makes Trump will eventually leave, but the problems that have surfaced that we have now seen because of Trump are things that are going to take a long time to fix.
This is I agree completely with what Mickey just said here. And don't misunderstand me. I don't think you will if you've heard what I've had to say. Donald Trump doesn't bother me as much as you might think, because he is what he is. He's turned out to be exactly what we thought he would be. What is shocking, though, is what he's doing to the rest of us, what he's doing to the political culture, what he's doing to our institutions, what he's revealing about us, what he's done to the entire the entire Republican Party has basically said, yeah, we're okay with all of this.
Right.
That damage is going to last an awful long time after he's gone.
Ramesh, I want to ask you a specific question here on that front, which is the legacy of Donald Trump's policy, right? There are huge questions as it pertains to what is the Republican position on trade at this point? What is the Republican position on immigration? What is the Republican position on family values? But also, there's the demographic reality, which is looming. America will be a minority white country in 2045. How does the current Republican Party, the politics of it at this moment, would ill serve the party in the coming years? Is there a way to pivot before that, given how strong and clear the rhetoric is to people of color in America?
Gosh, a lot to chew over in that. Look, I think that one of the very plausible scenarios here is that any short-term policy victories that conservatives and Republicans have gained end up being washed away by a demographic tide, by the fact that you've got these demographic changes in our country, not just in terms of the racial composition, but also the religious composition of our country. And this administration and this Republican Party doesn't seem to care at all about reaching out to rising groups in the electorate in the way that previous Republicans at least wanted to try to do. And I think you can make a case that leaving, not just the party, but elements of the conservative movement are going to find that they too made a Faustian bargain. Social conservatism is discrediting itself. That the white evangelical Christians have accelerated their decline by embracing this guy in a way that makes them look completely hypocritical and power hungry. And I think that the answer you get when you mention this problem to a lot of Trump supporting conservatives is essentially along the lines of, well, look, people who talked about this challenge to conservatism, they were saying Hillary was going to win. They were going to say this was going to doom Republicans in 2016, and they were wrong. All the experts were wrong. So why should we believe them this time? I think that's a short-sighted answer. I do think that on the other side, there was a kind of complacency among liberals about demographic change, delivering them the next election, that also proved to be short-sighted. But the long-term trends, I think, are still pretty clear.
Right. I think that we'd be surprised if all of those numbers and projections and birth rates ended up being just not true, right? Let's just turn the page a little bit to 2018. We're in an election year. I'd love to get everybody's expectations for what they think is going to happen in terms of the House and the Senate. So maybe we can, if to the degree that you guys feel okay prognosticating, but also, would it be actually maybe a good thing for moderate Republicans if the House was lost to Democrats?
Let me start taking that up. Keep in mind that if that happens, the portion of the Republican conference that loses their seats most is the moderate Republicans. It's the Republicans who have been most critical of Trump who are least likely to come back. Keep in mind
but we also should point out a wave of people not seeking re-election are by and large moderates who are likely to be replaced by more hardline Republicans, right? So the caucus composition is going to change no matter what.
And then the other, there is a kind of, if you are a Trump critical conservative in a way, this is a no-win election, because if Republicans gain in the Senate and hold the House, this becomes, Trump isn't political poison. If you lose the House and the Senate, then it becomes, well, the problem is they weren't Trumpy enough. The problem is Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan were too weak and not sufficiently allied with Donald Trump. A lot of Trump opponents, they think that's insane, right? They think Trump and McConnell have done everything McConnell and Ryan have done everything Trump wants. That is not the way that Trump supporters view things.
Even if the Democratic turnout is like stratospheric, you don't think President Trump shoulders any of the blame if Republicans lose the House?
Do I believe that objectively he would shoulder some of the blame? Absolutely.
Right.
Do I think that is the way it will be spun and that Republicans will internalize the lesson that he's to blame? No, I don't.
What is truth these days? So prognostication, Ramesh makes a very important point that if Republicans hold the House and the Senate, it is not status quo. It will be dramatically more Trumpian. It will be seen as a ratification and a vindication of Trumpism. They will move much more aggressively. A lot of the legislation that did not pass, that Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell were not able to get through, will pass. So I think people need to understand that this is not a status quo election in any way whatsoever. So you asked the question, what are those swing voters, those moderate Republicans, maybe the reluctant Trump voters? That's why I do think the tactics of the left matter. Mm-hmm. The Maxine Waters comments, urging people to go out and harass things. There can be a backlash against all of that will push those people. Let's talk about anti-Trumpism. The key dynamic you asked before about why would people support Roy Moore. Don't underestimate how intensely tribal our politics has become, how intense the alternative reality has become. We have 40% of Americans who have a completely different view of politics and issues than the other 40%. So I do think that the House is in play. I think it's probably more likely than not Republicans still hold the Senate, though.
Mickey?
my wife and I were speaking at a conference in Madrid just before the last presidential election, and we said, no problem, Hillary's going to win. So, I mean, I don't think, I'm not sure that you
You're
want
not
me,
alone in
you don't want me
thinking that,
prognosticating. If I looked at this, I think the results are going to be not nearly as good for Democrats as they think will be. Democrats have this wonderful ability to fool themselves and believe their own rhetoric and think that certainly anybody who has a brain and is alive must agree with them. And they've shown a remarkable ability to blow elections that they should win. I think if I had to bet today, I would bet that Republicans are still going to hold one house, and if they lose the other one, it'll be close. And Republicans are still going to have the majority of the governorships and the majority of the state legislative seats. I'm a little bit where George will and others have been about, it would be a good time for the Republican Party to take a bath and a wake-up call. But right now, I'm not as optimistic as I would like to be. And I completely agree with what Charlie said, and I think what Ramesh said, is that I think there is a very good possibility, because I know this Republican Party, that if Republicans do lose seats, it's going to be, see, you weren't tough enough. You weren't tough enough. One thing I want to disagree with you slightly. I think Paul Ryan has already ruined his legacy. I don't think he has a legacy left. But
well, I don't totally disagree with that. No.
Christine, the implications for Donald Trump keeping both houses for the Republican Party, what concerns you the most?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm with George Will and others. I don't want the Republicans to keep the House. I think there needs to be a check on him. So personally, I'm not rooting for them to keep the House.
Yeah.
So I'm not really very interested in ways that they can keep the House. I think the Democrats should take the House. And I mean, I think we need to have some legitimate check and balance on him.
Can I bring, I can't believe it's taken me over 30 minutes to bring his name up, but the sort of looming specter in terms of the check on Donald Trump is Robert Mueller, potentially, or not, we don't know. But as it concerns your Republican Party at this moment, what is your level of optimism about how much Republicans in Congress will take the findings seriously and do something if something is warranted? I'm going to come to you, Charlie, but I'd love to know your thoughts, Christine, as someone who thinks the Democrats should take the House.
I'm of mixed mind about that. I mean, there's Trey Gowdy's on his way out, but I've been impressed that he's been in a position to sort of take this seriously. I haven't been very impressed with the Republicans and their ability to stand up to Trump, or even to have a spine, quite frankly. So I don't know what they're going to do with Mueller. Now, in all these Republican primaries, that have been occurring, what's been happening is, first of all, you have to beat the other person to be a lover of Trump, right? So it becomes a who can love Trump and be like Trump the most in a Republican primary. But also in the rhetoric in the Republican primary is basically, we need to end this fake, Russian investigation, which and Republicans think that's true. So their constituents, if we've got, if you wipe out in a wave the moderate Republicans, which were going to happen, and you have Republicans returning from these deep red districts, their constituents don't think the Mueller thing is real. They
so
think
that
it's
sounds
fake.
like zero confidence.
I guess I'm talking myself into that now. Yeah,
Charlie,
Okay.
you've been on the front lines.
Yeah. I'm kind of obsessed about this because I think this investigation is so important. I am old enough, I'm even older than Ramesh, I am old enough to remember when Republicans and conservatives would have really cared about a Russian attack on this country.
Right.
It is mind-boggling
I'm
to
old
me
enough to remember that too.
to watch the indifference to this, especially knowing that it is an ongoing attack. I'm also very optimistic that Robert Mueller will do a professional job. We do not know all the things he has. I think that he is uncovering everything. I think all the speculation about where he's going is often uninformed. So I do expect something significant to come from it. But going back to your prognostication, if Republicans win the House and they win the Senate, this will so embolden the president, he will fire Robert Mueller. the consequences will be very dramatic. The chances that Republicans will take having won this election, take strong action are absolutely zero, whatever is below zero. And to a certain extent, and I really I'm not endorsing this opinion, it's just an honest take, I think it is, that Donald Trump has already succeeded in winning a major battle, which is he has made this a red-blue issue. He has cast it in partisan terms. In order to avoid impeachment and removal, all he needed to do was to hold the Republican base. That's the only thing he needed to do. Then he assures that impeachment will fail, and I think he's succeeded in doing that so far, unless Mueller comes up with something that we can't even imagine, which is possible.
Ramesh, are you confident that there is an overlay of partisanship, or at least there is an attempted overlay of partisanship on the Mueller investigation? Do you feel confident that conservative media will give a fair assessment of what Robert Mueller has found? I mean, obviously, liberal media is going to do, or the failing New York Times, whatever you want to call not conservative media, but because it is an outcry. There is a relationship between what's happening with the party in Congress and what's happening in the party in media. And I wonder, to what degree are you confident that the analysis will be fair?
Yeah, so there's a bit of a closed loop here, so that a lot of conservative media will take their cue from where Republican voters are and vice versa. And so they're sort of locked into this cycle of support for Trump. So, I mean, if the question is, do I think that Fox News will be devoid of voices who speak up for Mueller? No, I think there will be one or two people on Fox News who will...
Shep Smith.
Jonah Goldberg, as Charlie mentioned. But I think that the overwhelming thrust of the commentary will be pro-Trump and anti-Mueller. Unless something has happened to weaken Trump's support among Republicans before that, like a recession. Otherwise, I don't see that changing.
That would have to be a quickly moving recession storm front.
Yeah, can I just add that there's one additional problem, and that is the Office of Legal Counsel of the Justice Department, which has absolutely no status in law. Its lawyers giving suggestions, and they get taken more seriously than they should, continues to insist that the president cannot be indicted. There is nothing in the Constitution that suggests a president cannot be indicted. And so impeachment is not the only possible answer. Impeachment is a purely political decision. It doesn't depend on law necessarily, but indictment does, and it is possible. And I think if the Supreme Court took it up, I think the Supreme Court would say that the Office of Legal Counsel doesn't know what it's talking about, and that the president can be indicted and can be convicted.
Let me ask you two more questions.
Somebody has to indict him first before there's a case.
Well, right. That's someone in Congress, right? So we're going to go to the audience in a couple minutes, but I want to ask you guys two questions. I, as part of my work in the circus, have been out in the country going to pro-Trump rallies, NRA conventions, and the rest. And I think that once again, the media is missing the Jeremy Peters' story notwithstanding. The media is largely missing the fervor, the just die-hard nature of support for this president among Republican voters. I went into that show at the beginning of this year. We started out in Russia, and there was there's so much talk about a blue wave and how there's just no consideration that President Trump is going to get reelected. I came away after 6 weeks on the road thinking there is absolutely a possibility that he will get reelected. What, if not a likelihood, right? Where do you sit in terms of, how do you, obviously there's a certain baseline of anguish that a lot of the NeverTrump camp is feeling. At the same time, if you're staying in the Republican Party, there's also got to be some kind of internal strategizing, at least about how are you going to survive the next 4 years? How are you going to survive potentially I guess it's not 4 years, I'm not doing the math right. 6 years, 6 years. The vodka. I know, it's the altitude and the lights. How do you think about the 2020? How do you control your level of anguish, and how do you think about the sort of coming to elections and steel yourself, as it were?
Well, anguish is not too strong a word. I mean, the last year and a half for me has been this soul-crushing slog of disillusionment. So I'm tempted to say day by day, but your analysis is absolutely correct. My book was How the Right Lost Its Mind, and my publisher wants me to update it for the paperback edition and answer the question, was it worse than I thought it would be? And my answer is, I'll give it away, which is yes, fundamentally, not because of the policy changes, but because of what the Republican Party has become. And this fervor that you describe, which is something that is, I assume that there are parallels in American political history, but I think there are more parallels in European history and other, the sense of that we've lost the complacency about America, that we always thought America was immune from history, that things wouldn't happen here. I don't want to get too hysterical about all of this, but how do I deal with all of this? I know there are people who, want to embrace the Democratic Party, but some of us have to be here to say, look, there is another form of conservatism that is not Trumpism. At least be witnesses to that. Provide more.
So stay in the party.
Well, I'm not really part of the party, but I'm not willing to embrace Bernie Sanders. Because, look, if we all embrace Bernie Sanders, then who's left in the Republican Party?
Well,
Do you want one of the
look,
major political parties to be nuts? I mean...
Well, but Democrats would say it's not a good thing for all the...
Well, that's
the
right.
tent can only be so big, right?
So
there are serious differences
We have to
between moderate Republicans and
Right.
centrist Democrats and liberal Democrats.
And we have to provide moral support for those, lonely few out there, whether it's John McCain, who's on the way out, unfortunately, or Jeff Flake, or others to do it. And then at some point try to pick up the pieces. But it is going to be, to say that it is lonely, and this is not complaining, it's just to understand that when you see NeverTrump Republicans like Ramesh and I on CNN and MSNBC, we're kind of unicorns. That we are really outliers of what's going on. And that all of this intense tribalism and the coarsening and what Trump is doing to our discourse, all of that will get worse before it gets better. So part of it is taking a deep breath and realizing that we have not necessarily hit bottom yet. And I totally agree with Mickey that I think a lot of this talk about the blue wave is excessive optimism, and that people need to be smart. Do you want? Can I say we're in a bar, right? So I can use some words.
Yeah, we are. We're drinking.
So my whole day on Twitter was saying, hey, I found this quote: when you have a choice between being right and being kind, choose kindness. And I got thousands of emails back, basically, on Twitter saying...
Messages, not emails.
Fuck you.
It's good they were on Twitter, not emails.
The kindness and the civility is what got us Trump. To which my response was, I'm not sure that's what did it. That if you really want to, get through this, there's a coalition of the decent out there. And somehow that's going to have to coalesce. The angry, the in-your-face, the F-bombs and everything, that is not going to do it because we haven't touched bottom yet.
So the answer is ready the supplies, pack for a long winter.
Well, maybe.
Winter is coming.
First of all,
here.
yeah, it is very cold. But first of all, I don't really care whether the Republican Party survives. It could disappear, and I think we'd all be great. I don't care about either party. I think the political party system is what is destroying us. I think the political party system is narrowing all of the differences that we would have on a normal basis into Team A or Team B, and you have to destroy each other. I think George Washington was right, and Madison was right, and Monroe was right. Don't create them. We did, and we're paying a price for it. But at this point, the Republican Party has, I think, lost, not just because of the people in the Congress who are not doing their job, but all of 90% of these people who call themselves Republicans believing things that are stomach churning, and whether it's at the border or sitting down with and letting the North Koreans, take us for a ride, or whatever it is, the Republican Party, if it disappeared, it would mean no great loss.
Christine?
There's a lot I can say about this. I had a reporter friend, much like you did, sort of ask the question or basically say to me, and I said, look, the Republican Party as I know it, I made a contract with the Republican Party in the late 80s when I came out of college. The Republican Party as I know it is gone. And she said, but you have to stay and fight for it. And I said, no, it's gone. It's not there. The coalition of people who make up Republicans is entirely different. And, I helped John Kasich's campaign, right? So I tried. I tried, and when Donald Trump won the primary, I took a deep breath, and my partner at Burning Glass Consulting, which we formed in late 2013 to help the Republican Party focus on women, she took a leave of absence from Burning Glass Consulting to start the number one anti-Trump PAC that our Principles PAC is what it was called, right? And so basically our great idea for Burning Glass, we had one great cycle of like really working, and because we had the RNC came up with the post-2012,
Yes.
what do we call that?
It was an autopsy, which
right.
was probably not the best choice, because autopsy implies the
dead.
body is dead.
Right,
Now they need
so-
an exorcism.
Yes, something like that.
But so we thought we were moving in the right direction, and then like sharp detour. So basically the idea that Burning Glass would stay together and help Republicans win women voters became laughable when we had Donald Trump as a nominee. I mean, it was laughable. So there's that, and then it's not just Donald Trump. As a person who's a pollster, I look at the data. And I say, these people, so for example, after the white supremacist demonstrations in Charlottesville, Virginia, right? So Trump said, oh, they're, basically good people on both sides.
Yeah.
They're both two sides of the story. And Republican elected officials immediately, playing from their old playbook, denounced that, right? Because they thought that's what we do. But then the Republican primary elected, we did some surveys, and they basically said, yeah, there were two sides to this. Both sides were to blame for this. So I'm not comfortable staying in a party with attitudes like that.
You're making a really important point here, which is the distinction, like the anguish is not just directed at Donald Trump, it's directed at Republican voters. It's the people in
That's
the party.
the worst part of it. Because he could pass from the scene. And if there was a party that you recognized, I'm sorry, I get a little bit kind of wound up about this. But if there was a party that you recognized to work with or toward, but on every poll you're seeing, Putin, for example, Republicans
Yes.
hated Putin, and now they like him.
Putin's numbers are trending
And
up.
it's just nuts. So it's like, would you affiliate with a party with attitudes like that? So for me, the answer is no.
Ramesh, we're looking at 6 more years of Donald Trump?
I think very possible. Look, incumbents tend to win. It's very hard to unseat an incumbent president. I think it's only been done 3 times in the last century. And I would say, it certainly seems to me that so far liberals and Democrats don't seem as interested in getting the wavering Trump supporter, the person who voted for Trump last time but isn't completely sold on him to change his or her mind, as they are in telling them, you're a terrible person, we don't like you, and we don't like the way you act, the way you think, or the way you live your life. That, to me, seems to me like a recipe. It doesn't mean you're absolutely going to lose in 2020 as liberals and Democrats, but I do think it makes it harder to win. And I think that there's this sense, look, the Hillary Clinton campaign was largely premised on the idea that this guy is so unacceptable, we don't have to give an inch on anything that conservatives
Which
care
is,
about.
by the way, still part of very much the Democratic playbook.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's
It's not
right.
even about giving an inch. It's the platform itself is undeveloped because it's largely opposition to Donald Trump.
But to the extent that there is a platform, it has been moving leftward. It has not been moving more toward the center. And that's been true for a very long time, but I think that's probably accelerated under Trump. For those of us who are non-Trump Republicans and conservatives, I think that in addition to all the other things we've talked about, most of which I agree with, I would say there are 2 things that we have to reckon with. And that is, number one, the extent to which the pre-Trump Republican Party was already on a course that was encouraging some of these destructive tendencies.
Right.
So,
right.
for
this
example,
is part of this is this is a longer trajectory.
so, for example, I think that there was a value to having a conservatism that could, say on some issues and on some occasions, shucks, professor, I think you're wrong. I think that you can take that too far towards a total delegitimation of knowledge and expertise, and we did that. Number two, we had a blind spot with respect to this changing conservative-Republican coalition. We had a coalition that the party didn't truly represent. It didn't truly represent the economic interests of its own voters, and that created an opening that Trump could exploit. I am not sure that the anti-Trump conservatives have really reckoned with that problem yet either.
On that note, very, very well said, Ramesh, unsurprisingly. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So if you want to raise your hand, gentleman over here was the first one up. There was a mic coming to you.
During your comments earlier, there was this observation that there is a racial shift in America, and by 2045 will be, I guess, minority-majority was the comment?
Right, although technically they're not minorities if they're in the majority.
Exactly.
Minority white.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I live in Texas, where that's going to be true 4 years from now, not 20-plus years from now. And one of the things I find is interesting, there was an assumption that when that happens, that just means game over, favor Democrats. No, nobody actually said that, but that was sort of like the unstated implication. And I've always wondered about that because I know from some research from the Pew Trust that the average Hispanic in America on issues of private school vouchers and abortion is more conservative than the average Republican primary voter. And so I think Hispanics are kind of the wild card that could go either direction, and you can't necessarily assume that that's just a winner for Democrats.
Well, right. I think we're probably looking at it in the context of perhaps this administration's rhetoric as it concerns Hispanics and immigrants. But go ahead.
That
it's
is
a fair
an excellent point. And by the way, that was something that I said for probably 10 years because on exactly those issues, and then comes along Donald Trump. And so how long is it going to take for Republicans to say, hey, remember when Donald Trump was demonizing you, when was talking about mass deportations and building the wall, engaging in this kind of rhetoric?
Bad hombres.
Yeah. I mean, and Republicans will say, that wasn't us. Well, of course it was them at some point. So I do think that Donald Trump is doing to the Hispanic vote nationally what Republicans in California did over the last decade or so. California used to be a very, very competitive state. Until Pete Wilson won some things that he probably shouldn't have won, and now it's a one-party state. But it's an excellent point. A lot of these groups, I think, were very, very much in play, and that's one of the problems of the toxification. I also want to just underline something that Ramesh said about the conservative movement, is that I think that one of our jobs is we have to distinguish between the conservatives who disgrace themselves and the ideas which are still valid, but also we do need to have this honest reckoning of which of those ideas might have led to the moment, and why did we ignore Ramesh when he was writing about the Walmart conservatives? Because, to his credit...
I ask myself that question every day.
I
ask my kids that. Why are you
Okay,
ignoring
let me
Ramesh?
tell you why I'm bringing this up, is you wrote about this in 2006, and guys like me, we weren't paying attention to you back then, and then it's like, well, where did this come from? Well, we didn't ask those questions.
I'm making you guys... Which is also another reason, I mean, when you look at all that, the inroads that the Republican Party could be making with Hispanic voters, it sort of begs the question, what happened to George W. Bush-style Texas conservatism, right?
So one quick thing about race. So a lot of those projections do depend on how people define themselves. So do my kids who are half white define themselves as white? Do they define themselves as Asian? Do they define themselves as other? The 2045 majority-minority thing assumes that people who are partly non-white define themselves as not white. I don't know. Whiteness has a way of hanging on in this country.
That is true. And if you're interested in that theme, Ramesh, everyone should come to my book talk tomorrow, which specifically addresses the idea of being mixed race in this present American moment. Okay, with that plug right there.
Thank you. Hi, Mickey. So, Mickey, you referenced, it's Pamela. Hi. You referenced Eric Hoffer, who said, hatred is the most accessible and comprehensive of all the unifying agents. And Charlie, I don't know if this is the tweet you were referring to, but you tweeted, you know what makes politics so toxic. This is the tweet. The refusal to entertain the possibility that your opponent might be a decent human being despite being wrong about an issue. So I'd like to know from you what we can do to encourage this sort of rehumanization of the other.
That's a great question.
And I wish I had an answer I could give you in the next 5 minutes how to do that. I mean, that's the great challenge. Because I think we're headed in the opposite direction. You and I can have a different view of the flat tax. You and I can have a different view of the relationship between power between the states and the federal government, the balancing. You know, we could have a lot of different things, but that doesn't mean you're an awful, terrible human being. And I think that increasingly we're at this. And I wrote that tweet, and the context may seem a little bit awkward here, but I was on the night that Paul Ryan retired, and I was on one of the MSNBC shows. And I said, look, I've known Paul Ryan for 20 years, and I think he's a decent man who made fundamentally bad choices. And I just got overwhelmed by people who said, how can you say that he's a decent human being? If you vote in a certain way, you must be a terrible human being. That's part of the problem, because honestly, you can't have a conversation with somebody where you say, by the way, I think you're ugly. I think your mother's a whore, and I want to throw all your kids out of the country. Would you like to hear my ideas about education now? You know, can we now talk about all of these things? And no, until we are able to talk to one another as people. And one of the things that one of maybe the positive things that I've experienced in this era is realizing that there are people in this country that actually are kind of horrified by the tribalism and want to have that conversation. But it's going to be incredibly difficult.
Mickey?
I was just going to add, Pam, that one of the problems to shift away for a moment from Trump and even from Republican voters, we do a very terrible job in this country in our schools of teaching about civics, about critical thinking, about how to evaluate issues. Until we do a better job of having an enlightened electorate, having an educated citizenry, it's going to be really hard to overcome some of this.
I just want to make a point also. I think one of the things that happened with the legalization of gay marriage, for example, was that increasingly people who sort of held a view that this was something they opposed became acquainted with the fact that they knew someone, either in their family or in their neighborhood, who was gay. And I think one of the things that would really help this process is, and I hear it all the time, a friend of my daughter's worked on Capitol Hill, and she ended up working with someone, a young college woman, went to a Christian university, super conservative. She was very liberal, and she just didn't know how to process the fact that she was really nice, and she really liked her. And so I think the more that we mix with people who are not like us, that it's actually critical to do that.
I want to piggyback on that excellent point. We know fewer people than we used to. If we're conservatives or we're liberals, we spend more time with people who are like-minded. We consume more media that is for the like-minded. But we all still know people whom we love who have different politics than us. And we make, in a lot of cases, a mental exemption. Conservatives are like this, not my friend. Liberals are like this, not my sister. And I think we need to, when we hear, if you're a conservative and you hear a fellow conservative saying something about liberals, stop and think, he's talking about my sister, right? Is that fair? Is that kind of contempt really warranted? And vice versa. And we need to stop thinking about people just as abstract enemies, but as actual people.
And we should think about people who are different from us as being ambassadors in a way, right? This is a diplomatic process. This is part of the fabric that connects us as Americans. We have time for one more question. You, sir, in the front row are the winner.
Thank you very much. So there's been a lot of talk about already Democrats maybe challenging Trump in the 2020 question, but not a lot about Trump, winning his own nomination. He didn't win Iowa. He only got 35% in New Hampshire. What is the chance that there's one NeverTrump Republican that challenges him? And if they do, maybe defeat him in the early primary, give him a run for his money.
On a wing and a prayer. Anyone want to take that?
So I would love to see it happen, but In addition to the fact, look, right now, as we've all discussed, Trump has very strong support among Republicans, or at least among people who are still willing to call themselves Republicans. That could change, but I think there's another problem that doesn't get enough attention, which is that the opposition among Republicans, conservatives to Trump is internally divided. There are moderate Republicans who are against him. There are very conservative Republicans who are against him. There are people who are against him in part because he is allied with the NRA. There are people who are against him, but that's one of the things they like about him. That kept them from winning, right? I mean, he was getting 45, 40, actually 35%. He ended up with more than that. But the Kasich voters and the Cruz voters liked Trump better than they liked the other person on the other pole of the party. That hasn't changed. I'm not sure how it changes between now and 2020, and that, I think, makes it very hard to see this happening.
Kasich voters didn't like Trump at all.
But look, if you looked at the second choice of Kasich voters, Trump outpolled Cruz, and among Cruz, second choice voters, Trump outpolled Kasich. At least every survey that I saw publicly.
I'm from Wisconsin. We beat him in the primary, remember? He did lose. Chances are 0 in 2020, though.
To my friends on stage, we know this is a hard time for you. We wish you well. We wish you strength. We wish you safe passage on this twisted road we call the American Project. Thank you for your time.